Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk Talk Speak. Get ready, because today on the deep dive, we're tackling an absolutely fascinating transformation story. It's about the Danish energy company Ørsted.
Exactly. We're looking at how this company, which started life as DO Energy, the Danish oil and natural gas company, managed this huge pivot.
Yeah, a really radical pivot.
Imagine going from being one of Europe's biggest polluters, like super heavily invested in coal and oil,
Right.
to being this globally recognized leader in offshore wind and, well, sustainable energy. It's a shift almost no one really saw coming back then.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you look at the numbers, isn't it? Not that long ago, like 85% of their power and heat came from coal.
85%.
And their coal plants alone accounted for, a third of Denmark's total emissions.
Yeah.
Now they're held up as a sustainability champion.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really dig into the how. How did this happen?
What were the key moments?
What were the pivotal decisions? What were the major roadblocks? And maybe most importantly, what can we as listeners trying to understand the future of energy actually learn from their experience? We've got a pretty detailed account of Ørsted's whole evolution as our main source material here.
Great. So where do we start? The beginning.
Okay, so let's set the scene.
First,
Ørsted's story really starts back in the 1970s.
right, as Dong.
As Dong Energy, yeah. It was a state-owned enterprise, and its main focus was getting oil and gas out of the North Sea.
Standard stuff for the time.
Pretty standard. But over time, through some smart acquisitions, they grew. They became the dominant electricity producer in Denmark.
And coal-fired power was their bread and butter.
Totally. Their main game.
That's right. I mean, if you look at 2006, their reliance on coal was, well, almost total, like you said, 85%.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember the business landscape back then. This was generally seen as a solid, reliable way to make money.
Sure.
Fossil fuels were the established kings of the energy world. It seemed stable.
But even as they were kind of riding that fossil fuel wave, there were definitely signs of what was coming, weren't there? Challenges on the horizon.
Oh, absolutely. The science around climate change was getting much clearer, much louder.
And the pressure to actually do something about carbon emissions was building. You couldn't ignore it.
No, you couldn't. And looking back, the 2008 global financial crisis played a really significant role too, perhaps unintentionally.
How so?
Well, it really exposed how volatile the fossil fuel markets could be, prices swinging wildly. And it started to squeeze the profitability of their oil and gas operations.
Ah, okay. So financial pressure adding to the environmental pressure.
Exactly. And this coincided almost perfectly with a really interesting trend on the other side of the equation.
Which was?
The cost of renewable energy technologies, particularly offshore wind, was starting to come down, slowly at first, but it was happening.
And governments were beginning to offer more policy support, right?
Yeah.
Subsidies and things.
Yes. Little nudges, bigger pushes. It was like the economic and the environmental winds were starting to shift direction at the same time.
Okay, so this brings us to 2008, a critical moment.
Absolutely. It was right in the middle of all this, in 2008, that Ørsted, well, DO back then, faced a real fork in the road.
A strategic crossroads.
Definitely. And their CEO at the time, Anders Eldrup, he proposed something truly radical, a complete overhaul of the company's direction.
This was the big vision, right? The 180-degree turn.
The big one.
To basically move away from the fossil fuels that had defined them for decades and become a renewable energy powerhouse instead.
Precisely. This was the birth of the 85-15 plan. A really catchy name, actually.
85-15. What did that mean specifically?
Well, their ambitious target was to completely reverse their energy mix by 2040. So flip it from 85% fossil fuels and 15% renewables.
Which is where they were around 2006.
Right. Flip that to 85% renewables and just 15% fossil fuels by 2040.
Wow. Okay, that sounds incredibly ambitious for 2008.
It was monumental. You have to remember how new and, frankly, how expensive offshore wind technology was back then.
Yeah, not exactly mainstream yet.
Not at all. And there was very little broad market acceptance, real belief that green energy could scale up like that.
Yeah.
Setting that goal, it really makes you wonder about the initial internal reactions. Must have been some skepticism.
Exactly. You can just imagine the boardroom conversations. Was this driven purely by, environmental conviction?
Yeah.
Or were there some really sharp strategic minds looking long-term?
I think it was likely a powerful combination of both, actually. The external pressure from environmental groups and growing public awareness was certainly a factor. You couldn't ignore it.
Right.
But internally, I think there was also this dawning realization about the long-term vulnerability of a business model so heavily dependent on fossil fuels.
Especially with stricter rules coming down the pipe.
Exactly. Especially with increasingly stringent carbon emission regulations coming from Europe, they could probably see the writing on the wall, you know? This isn't sustainable forever.
And I suppose they also recognize the untapped potential, the upside.
Yes, the potential of the renewable energy market, especially offshore wind, given Denmark's geography.
All that North Sea wind.
Exactly. Denmark's strong wind resources were a key natural asset just waiting to be properly harnessed. It was definitely a gamble back in 2008, but one with potentially huge upside if they could pull it off.
Okay, so the vision is set in 2008. What were the first concrete steps?
Well, it was around 2008 that we started seeing those very first tangible moves. Increased investment, tentative at first, into those early offshore wind projects.
Testing the waters.
Literally. And also the initial discussions about what to do with their aging coal-fired power plants. Do we just shut them down eventually? Or can we find new, greener ways to operate them, convert them?
Okay, so the period that followed, say 2009 to 2012, this seems like it was all about laying the groundwork, taking those initial, maybe tentative steps into this new green world.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The 85-15 plan was officially adopted in 2009, so that put the stake in the ground, solidified their commitment.
Made it real.
Made it real. And we saw those early crucial investments in actual offshore wind farms. Denmark's Horns Rev 1 is a great example from that era.
What did that project show?
Well, it proved the concept could work. You know, you can generate significant power offshore. But importantly, it also highlighted the challenges. The very high upfront costs and the steep learning curve involved in just building and operating these massive installations out at sea.
It must have been incredibly complex. I mean, just the logistics of constructing these giant turbines in a harsh marine environment seems daunting.
Absolutely. And that's why this period, 2009, 2012, was marked by really intense collaboration with the supply chain.
They couldn't do it alone.
No way. Ørsted was working hand in glove with manufacturers, pushing the boundaries of wind turbine technology. They needed larger, more efficient turbines.
And better ways to install them.
Exactly. Developing innovative techniques for installing them further out in deeper water. It was a joint effort.
And you mentioned earlier, this needed a massive internal cultural shift, too. How do you even begin to tackle that? Changing the whole mindset of a company built on oil, gas, and coal for decades.
Yeah, that's often the hardest part, isn't it? It was a fundamental transformation internally. It involved significant investment in retraining their existing workforce.
Giving them new skills.
Exactly. Equipping them with the skills needed for this new renewable energy sector. But it also meant strategically recruiting experts who already had that green energy know-how. People who understood wind power.
So bringing in new blood.
Right. They were essentially trying to blend the old expertise, the project management skills from oil and gas, with this new green vision and technical capability. Not easy.
Okay, then we move into the next phase, maybe 2013 to 2016. It sounds like that's when the transition really started to pick up speed, gain momentum.
Exactly. That period feels like an acceleration. A key factor was the arrival of a new CEO, Henrik Poulsen, in 2013.
What changed with him?
He seemed to inject a new sense of urgency and, perhaps even more importantly, focus. Offshore wind was clearly identified, unequivocally, as the core of their future business.
No more hedging bets.
Less so, it seems. And that firm target to completely phase out coal by 2023 was officially set during this time. That's a powerful statement of intent, sends a clear signal.
And they weren't just building new wind farms during this period. They were also actively looking at their existing fossil fuel infrastructure, right? Finding ways to make it greener.
Precisely. That was a key part of the strategy, converting some of their big coal-fired power plants to run on sustainable biomass.
Using wood pellets and things like that.
Yeah, certified sustainable biomass. It allowed them to leverage their existing grid connections and infrastructure while significantly reducing their carbon footprint compared to coal. It was a transitional step.
Smart. And alongside this greening of existing assets.
They began the gradual but very deliberate process of selling off their oil and gas assets, piece by piece, sending another clear signal about their future direction. No turning back.
But a real turning point maybe the biggest validation of their strategy, must have been around 2016 when the economics really started to shift in their favor.
Absolutely. 2016 was huge. For the very first time, the cost of generating electricity from new offshore wind projects became competitive with building new traditional fossil fuel plants like coal and natural gas in some parts of Europe.
Wow, so it wasn't just an environmental choice anymore.
Exactly. It was becoming an economic no-brainer, or at least a very viable economic choice.
What drove that cost reduction?
Several things. Advancements in turbine technology, bigger, more powerful turbines, more efficient installation methods like specialized vessels, and just the experience curve, learning by doing, economies of scale.
Okay, so the tech got better and cheaper, and then that same year, 2016, they launched that massive IPO, the initial public offering.
Yes, one of the largest globally at the time.
That must have sent a huge message to the financial world, right? About the viability, the bankability of their green strategy.
It was a tremendous vote of confidence from the market. The 2016 IPO raised a significant amount of capital, billions.
Which they needed for more wind farms.
Precisely. Which they could then reinvest in further offshore wind expansion. But it also clearly demonstrated that investors, big institutional investors, were beginning to see real commercial value in this green transition. It wasn't just nice to have anymore.
And the impact on their value.
Their market capitalization soared after the IPO. It transformed them into one of Europe's most valuable energy companies. Quite a turnaround.
Okay, so that brings us to 2017. It felt like they really sealed the deal then, making the ultimate commitment by completely getting rid of their oil and gas business.
Yeah, 2017 was profoundly symbolic. Selling off the last of their oil and gas production marked an undeniable final break with their fossil fuel past.
No going back.
No going back. And then, of course, the big name change.
To Ørsted.
To Ørsted. Honoring Hans Christian Ørsted, the Danish scientist whose discoveries in electromagnetism way back are fundamental to how wind power generation actually works.
That's a nice touch.
It was more than a nice touch, I think. It wasn't just a cosmetic change. It was a complete rebranding, embedding their commitment to a green future right into their core identity, saying, this is who we are now.
And from that point, 2017 onwards, it seems like they really hit the accelerator on global expansion, taking that offshore wind expertise worldwide.
Exactly. Having proven the model, reduced the costs, and secured the capital, they started moving much more aggressively into new international markets.
Where did they go?
Places like the Netherlands, the UK, of course, continued to be big, but also the United States and into Asia, starting with Taiwan.
They built some huge projects.
Yes, landmark projects like Borsel 1 and 2 in the Netherlands and Hornsea 1 in the UK, which was the world's first gigawatt-scale offshore wind farm. That's massive. These really showcase their technological prowess and their ability to deliver enormous green energy infrastructure.
So they became the dominant player in offshore wind. But they didn't just stick with that, did they? The period from, say, 2018 to 2020 saw them broadening out again.
Yes, that's right. They recognized the importance of diversifying their clean energy sources beyond just offshore wind, dominant as they were.
So what else did they get into?
They expanded into onshore wind and also solar power. A key move was acquiring a U.S.-based onshore wind company in 2018.
Giving them a foothold in North America for onshore, too.
A strong foothold, yeah. And they also began seriously exploring more cutting-edge technologies. Things like green hydrogen production using renewable electricity.
It's okay, the next frontier.
Potentially. Advanced energy storage solutions like large-scale batteries to help manage the intermittency of wind and solar. And continuing work on sustainable bioenergy.
Wow. And incredibly, during this time, they actually achieved that initial goal, the 85-15 plan, way, way ahead of schedule.
They did. It's quite remarkable. In 2019, they hit that milestone. They announced that 90% of their energy production was already coming from renewables.
90%.
90% in 2019. Remember, the original target was 85% by 2040.
So 21 years early.
Yeah, a full 2 decades ahead of schedule. It really shows the pace of change once they committed. And then in 2020, they received that significant recognition, named the world's most sustainable energy company by Corporate Knights.
Quite an accolade.
A huge one. And by then, they held a substantial share, maybe 25%, of the entire global offshore wind market, providing clean electricity to millions and millions of people. About 9.5 million, I think the figure was.
And instead of just celebrating reaching that massive goal early, They just set even more ambitious goals for the future, didn't they?
That's right. No resting on laurels. They announced even more aggressive targets, aiming for carbon neutrality in their own operations and energy production Scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2025.
2025, that's practically tomorrow.
Very soon. And extending that carbon neutrality goal to their entire value chain, including suppliers and the use of their products, Scope 3 by 2040. That's really ambitious.
Okay, so bringing us up to the present, say 2021 onwards, it sounds like they're just continuing to solidify that global leadership position and push the boundaries.
Absolutely. They're very active in developing new offshore wind markets across the globe. We're seeing recent significant projects and plans in the U.S., particularly off the East Coast like New Jersey, and also in Texas, where they're interestingly combining wind with energy storage.
Smart move.
And also expanding their presence further in Asia, beyond Taiwan, into places like Japan and potentially others. They're really consolidating.
And they hit that coal target early, too.
They did. They managed to completely phase out the use of coal in their power plants in 2023, beating their own target again.
Their ambitions just keep growing.
Seems so. Their current goal is to provide green electricity to 30 million people by 2025, and then scale that up to 50 million people by 2030. Huge numbers.
50 million people, wow.
And they're now also heavily focused on those harder-to-abate emissions. Decarbonizing their supply chain is a big priority, aiming to have those indirect Scope 3 emissions by 2032.
And even their company cars.
Yep, transitioning their entire vehicle fleet to electric. They stopped buying or leasing fossil fuel vehicles back in 2021, aiming for a fully electric fleet by 2025. Every little bit counts, I guess.
It really is an astonishing story. But surely, I mean, a transformation of this scale, this speed, it didn't happen without some major challenges along the way. What were the big hurdles they had to clear?
Oh, absolutely not. It wasn't a smooth ride. There were substantial financial pressures, particularly in the early days. Remember how expensive offshore wind technology was initially?
Right, and the returns were uncertain.
Very uncertain. Plus, they got hit by the 2008 financial crisis just as they were starting this pivot. And then there was that significant loss, I think around $1.78 billion in their legacy oil and gas business back in 2015. That certainly added to the financial strain.
So how did they manage those pressures?
Through a combination of things, it seems. Strategic partnerships helped share the risk and cost. Raising capital through the IPO was crucial, and fundamentally, by demonstrating over time the long-term economic viability of their green investments, attracting patient capital.
Okay, so finance was one hurdle. What about the tech side? Building these massive farms out at sea.
Huge technical obstacles, just the complex engineering required for deep-sea installations, foundations on the seabed, dealing with corrosion, weather windows. It's incredibly challenging.
And the turbines just kept getting bigger, too.
Bigger and bigger, more complex. Managing that required intense innovation and, as we said, that very close collaboration with their technology suppliers, the turbine makers, the vessel operators, to constantly drive advancements and figure out how to overcome the technical hurdles safely and cost-effectively.
And we touched on it earlier, but that internal resistance, shifting the culture away from oil and gas, that must have been a really difficult, persistent hurdle.
It really was a major undertaking you can imagine. Persuading a workforce, many of whom had spent their careers in the relatively stable, profitable oil and gas industry, to embrace the uncertainties and the different skill set of a new renewable sector.
Takes some convincing.
It takes a lot of convincing. It required really clear communication of the vision from the top, significant investment in retraining programs, and, as we mentioned, a willingness to bring in new talent with the necessary green expertise. Overcoming that internal inertia that we've always done it this way mentality was absolutely critical.
And one more challenge, relying on government help. Navigating policies.
Yes, that's a big one, especially in the early stages. The development of offshore wind, like many renewables, was heavily reliant on supportive government policies, subsidies, contracts for difference, stable regulatory frameworks.
And that varies a lot country by country, right?
Hugely. So Ørsted had to become very adept at navigating these diverse, sometimes shifting, sometimes inconsistent regulatory landscapes in all the different countries they wanted to operate in. Ensuring the economic viability of their projects often depended on getting those policy details right.
Okay, so financial, technical, cultural, policy. Quite a list of challenges, but they clearly found a way through all of this.
Yeah.
So, stepping back, what would you say are the most significant achievements and the overall impact of this incredible transformation?
Well, the environmental impact is probably the most obvious and arguably the most important. a 98% reduction in their direct greenhouse gas emissions, their scope 1 and 2, since 2006.
90%.
It's huge. That significantly exceeds even the ambitious science-based targets aligned with the Paris Agreement. Just a massive decarbonization.
And economically, did the gamble pay off?
It certainly looks like it. We talked about the IPO success. They saw a dramatic turnaround in profitability around that time, with net profits surging, and that massive increase in their market capitalization we mentioned. It strongly demonstrates that going green, if done strategically, can be a really sound financial strategy.
And it helped make green energy cheaper overall.
Yes. By driving scale and innovation, they played a key role in that dramatic cost reduction curve for offshore wind, making green energy much more competitive globally and attracting significant institutional investment into the sector.
What about the social impact? Jobs and communities?
That's important too. They've created numerous high-skilled jobs, particularly in regions that embraced offshore wind development, like the Humber area in the UK, for example. And they generally talk about actively supporting community development and environmental protection projects alongside their wind farms, aiming for sustainable development.
And beyond their own company, they've really become a kind of beacon, haven't they? Setting an example for the whole energy industry.
Without a doubt. They've served as a powerful inspiration, maybe even a prod, for other major energy companies. You see others like Equinor, Total Energies, Shell now accelerating their own transitions towards renewables, partly perhaps because Ørsted showed it could be done profitably.
And others are coming to learn from them.
Yes, our source material mentions they've become a sought-after case study. Political leaders, business executives from countries like the US, Japan, China apparently come to learn from their experience, trying to understand how Denmark, and Ørsted specifically, managed to drive such a successful green energy transition.
So, as we look at their remarkable journey, pulling it all together, what are the key lessons that emerge? What can others learn for the broader global effort to transition to clean energy?
Well, I think the paramount lesson number one, is the absolute necessity of having a clear long-term vision, an unwavering commitment from the very top leadership. That 85-15 plan wasn't just talk. It drove decisions for over a decade.
So vision and commitment. What else?
Secondly, the crucial role of continuous technological innovation. And that strong collaboration across the entire supply chain. You need that to drive down costs relentlessly and make renewable energy sources truly mainstream and competitive with fossil fuels. That's undeniable from their story.
And the importance of government action, supportive policies. You mentioned that was key.
Absolutely critical. Consistent, stable, long-term green energy policies from governments create the reliable investment environment needed for these huge, capital-intensive renewable energy projects to actually get financed and built. Ørsted's experiences in Europe, particularly the UK, with its contract for difference scheme, really underscore this point.
Okay. And what about how they handled the exit from fossil fuels?
That's another key lesson, I think. Their phased approach. They didn't just switch off oil and gas overnight. They gradually divested assets. They repurposed some infrastructure, like converting coal plants to biomass. That offers a valuable model for managing the economic and social impacts of the transition, avoiding sudden shocks.
Makes sense. And ultimately, it seems it all comes back to the people within the organization, doesn't it? That cultural change.
Absolutely. You can have the best strategy in tech, but if your people aren't on board, if they don't have the right skills, it won't work. So investing heavily in reskilling your existing workforce and strategically recruiting new expertise in renewables is essential for any company attempting this kind of fundamental shift.
So wrapping it up, what's the key takeaway from Ørsted?
I think ultimately Ørsted's story powerfully illustrates that the green transition, moving to clean energy, it's not just an environmental responsibility, though it certainly is that. It's also a significant economic opportunity. But seizing that opportunity requires real courage, sustained innovation, and strong partnerships between business and government. It can be a win-win.
So to sum it all up then, Ørsted's journey is a truly compelling narrative of transformation, evolving from this major player in coal and oil,
A carbon-intensive giant.
to a global frontrunner in green energy. And in a relatively short time frame, really, when you think about it.
It is remarkable, from that pivotal green vision back in 2008 to their ambitious goals now for carbon neutrality by 2025 and providing green electricity to tens of millions of people. Their concrete actions, the milestones they hit, they provide a powerful roadmap, or at least a case study, for others to look at.
And it really highlights those critical elements we've discussed throughout.
Yeah.
You need that clear, ambitious strategy.
Gotta have the plan.
You need that relentless pursuit of technological innovation to bring costs down.
Super
You
important.
need supportive government policies providing stability.
Essential.
And maybe hardest of all, you need that deep-seated cultural shift within the organization itself.
Yeah, bringing the people along. All those pieces had to come together.
And it ties into what their chairman, Thomas Thune Anderson, said, which you quoted earlier.
Right. The energy transition is the core task of the world today. Ørsted's transformation, it's more than just one company's success story. It really has established a new benchmark, raised expectations for the entire global energy industry.
Looking ahead, it's definitely exciting to contemplate their future contributions. With continued advancements in offshore wind, the development of green hydrogen may be taking off, breakthroughs in energy storage, all working towards that goal of powering 50 million people with clean electricity.
Yeah. They've truly come to embody the spirit of the scientists they're named after, haven't they? Hans Christian Ørsted, discovering electromagnetism. Now the company Ørsted is kind of illuminating the path towards a greener energy future for all of us.
That's a great way to put it.
So maybe this leads to a final crucial thought for you, our listener, to take away.
Okay.
Reflect on the power we've seen here. The power of both large-scale corporate transformation like Ørsted's, but also the impact of our collective individual choices in driving the global energy transition forward. And maybe ask yourself, what other seemingly insurmountable challenges, perhaps in completely different industries, could potentially be overcome with a similar level of decisive commitment, strategic foresight, and sheer determination that Ørsted has so clearly demonstrated? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you. See you next time.